He thought he was going to freeze to death in a Colorado blizzard, alone in a natural rock shelter with nothing but his survival pack and fading hope. But when he moved a pile of loose stones to block the wind, he found a sealed steel door that had been hidden for nearly 50 years, and behind it was a secret worth $245 million that would force him to confront the guilt he'd been running from for over a decade. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The mountain had a way of keeping secrets. Marcus Kane had learned that truth over the 7 years he'd lived in the high country of the Colorado Rockies, miles from the nearest road, further still from anything resembling civilization. At 41 years old, he'd become what people down in the valley towns called a ghost, a man who'd walked away from everything and everyone, trading the noise of the world for the silence of 14,000-foot peaks and endless pine forests. His cabin sat at 11,000 feet, tucked into a canyon where the wind couldn't find it, and the snow piled 8 feet deep come January. He'd built it himself, log by log, nail by nail, with hands that remembered a different kind of work, hands that once held blueprints and engineering reports, hands that had signed off on safety inspections and mineral surveys, hands that had failed when it mattered most. Marcus didn't think about that anymore, or at least, he tried not to. He'd been checking his trapline that October morning when the sky changed. It had been clear at dawn, that crystal blue that only exists above 10,000 feet, so sharp it almost hurt to look at. But by 9, clouds were rolling in from the west, thick and gray, and moving fast. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. The wind picked up, bending the aspens double, shaking gold leaves loose like coins falling from torn pockets. Marcus knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. The mountain didn't care that it was only mid-October. When a storm wanted to arrive, it arrived. He should have turned back immediately, should have made for the cabin while he still had time. But there was one more trap to check, another mile up the ridge, and he'd seen fresh elk sign that morning. He told himself he had time. He told himself he knew these mountains. He was wrong on both counts. The snow started as he was resetting the trap. Small flakes at first, lazy and light, the kind that might blow over in an hour. But within 10 minutes, the flakes were coming thick and fast, driven sideways by wind that howled through the peaks like something wounded and angry. Visibility dropped to 20 feet, then 10, then nothing but white chaos. Marcus pulled his hood tight and started down, moving by memory and instinct. He knew this ridge. He'd walked it hundreds of times, but in a whiteout, even familiar territory becomes alien. The landmarks disappeared. The trail vanished under 6 inches of snow that kept coming, kept piling, kept erasing everything. His beard iced over within minutes. His eyelashes froze. Each breath burned his lungs. The temperature was plummeting fast, probably down to 10 degrees already. And with the wind chill, it felt closer to 20 below. He had his survival pack, always did. Fire starter, emergency blanket, water, jerky, a knife, a small tarp. But that wouldn't mean much if he couldn't find shelter soon. He'd been walking for 30 minutes when he realized he was lost. Not turned around. Lost. He'd somehow drifted off the ridge, probably when he'd tried to get out of the worst of the wind. Now he was somewhere on the eastern slope, in terrain he didn't recognize, surrounded by rock formations that looked like monsters in the swirling snow. The cold was getting inside him now. That deep cold that starts in your fingers and toes and works its way toward your core, slow and day, patient and inevitable. He'd seen men die from exposure. He'd pulled their frozen bodies out of collapsed mine shafts. Back when he still did that kind of work, he knew what he was facing. He pushed forward, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant dying. His hands were numb inside his gloves. His face had stopped hurting, which was worse than when it did hurt. The wind screamed, the snow fell, and Marcus Kane, who had survived a decade alone in these mountains, who had walked away from everything he'd ever known, began to wonder if this was how his story ended. Frozen, alone, forgotten. That's when he saw the rock face. It rose up out of the storm like a wall, dark stone veined with white quartz, maybe 30 feet high. At its base, barely visible through the snow, was a shadow that looked deeper than it should be. Marcus stumbled toward it, hope flaring hot in his chest. A cave, or at least an overhang. Something. He half fell into the opening, his legs giving out, as soon as he was out of the wind. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The howling dropped to a distant roar. The snow stopped hitting his face. He could breathe without the wind stealing the air from his lungs. He lay there for a full minute, just breathing, just being not dead. Then he forced himself to move. Staying still was dangerous. He needed to assess, needed to make a plan. He pulled off his pack with fingers that barely worked and dug out his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a natural rock shelter maybe 15 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The ceiling was low, just tall enough to stand in if you hunched. The floor was covered in loose stones, dirt, and what looked like animal scat, probably from mountain lions or bears that had used this place for shelter over the years. It wasn't much, but it would keep him alive. Marcus cleared a space near the back wall and spread out his tarp. He knew better than to try to build a fire. The smoke would have nowhere to go in a space this small. But he had his emergency blanket and enough layers to survive the night if he was careful. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind hitting notes that sounded almost human, almost like screaming. He ate some jerky, drank water from his bottle, and tried not to think about the cabin, about the warm stove, and the coffee he wouldn't be having. Tried not to think about how no one would come looking for him. No one even knew he was out here. That had been the point, after all. Complete isolation, total solitude. No one to answer to, no one to let down. The temperature inside the shelter was maybe 30 degrees, cold enough that his breath misted, but survivable. Marcus wrapped himself in the emergency blanket and settled against the back wall, trying to get comfortable. That's when he felt the draft. It was subtle, just a whisper of air moving against the back of his neck. But in a sealed rock shelter, there shouldn't have been any draft at all. He turned, shining his flashlight along the back wall. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just rough stone covered in centuries of water stains and mineral deposits. But then he noticed the pile of loose rocks in the far corner, bigger than the others, arranged almost deliberately. Marcus stared at the rocks for a long moment. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to conserve his energy, to focus on surviving the storm. But something about that draft nagged at him. Air moving meant space behind the wall. Space meant possibility. He crawled over to the pile and started moving stones. They were heavy, some of them 50 or 60 pounds, and his hands were still half frozen. But the work warmed him, got his blood moving again. He cleared the first layer, then the second. The draft got stronger. He could feel it now. Cold air, flowing from somewhere behind the rockfall. It took him 20 minutes to clear enough stones to see what was hidden underneath. When his flashlight beam, finally, cut through the gap he'd created, Marcus stopped breathing. There was a door, a steel door, set flush into the rock face, painted the same color as the stone around it. It was about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, reinforced with rivets along the edges. In the center was a heavy wheel lock, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a ship's bulkhead. The metal was pitted with rust, but the door itself looked solid. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. A steel door, hidden behind a rockfall, in a natural shelter miles from anywhere. This wasn't some mining claim or old prospector's cache. This was something else. Something deliberate. Something secret. He reached out and touched the door, half expecting it to be an hallucination brought on by hypothermia. But it was real. Cold. Solid. Real. The wheel lock was stiff, frozen in place by decades of rust and mountain weather. Marcus braced himself and pulled. Nothing. He tried again, putting his weight into it. The metal groaned, protesting, but didn't move. On his third attempt, something gave. The wheel turned maybe an inch, accompanied by a shriek of metal on metal that echoed through the small space. Marcus kept working it, back and forth, each rotation freeing it up a little more. His shoulders burned, his hands screamed, but he couldn't stop now. Whatever was behind this door had been hidden for a reason, and every cell in his body needed to know why. After 10 minutes of work, the wheel spun free. Marcus heard a series of heavy clunks as internal bolts retracted. He set his shoulder against the door and pushed. It swung inward with a groan that sounded almost pained, like the mountain itself objecting to its secrets being disturbed. Cold air rushed out, stale and dry and strange. Marcus shined his flashlight into the darkness beyond. A tunnel, maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, carved straight into the rock. The walls were smooth, worked with tools, not natural. The floor was level. And about 20 feet in, the tunnel opened into something larger. Marcus hesitated. Every logical part of his brain said to close the door, pile the rocks back, wait out the storm, and pretend he'd never seen this. But curiosity was a powerful thing, especially for a man who'd spent 7 years alone with nothing but his own thoughts for company. He grabbed his pack and stepped inside. The tunnel was cold, colder than the shelter behind him, but at least there was no wind. Marcus moved slowly, his flashlight beam bouncing off worked stone walls. Someone had put serious effort into this. The tunnel was too uniform, too precise to be anything but man-made. But who would carve a tunnel this deep into a mountain, miles from any road or town, and then hide it behind a sealed door? The tunnel opened into a room. Marcus stepped through and stopped dead, his flashlight beam sweeping across something he couldn't immediately process. The space was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a natural dome about 12 feet overhead. But it was what filled the room that stole his breath. Crates, dozens of them. Wooden crates stacked along the walls, some sealed, some partially open. Metal containers, heavy-duty plastic cases, filing cabinets. And in the center of the room, illuminated by his shaking flashlight beam, was a wooden desk with papers scattered across its surface, covered in dust so thick it looked like gray snow. Marcus moved deeper into the room, his heart pounding. He approached the nearest crate and shined his light on the stenciled text on its side. The paint was faded, but he could still make out the words, "Property of Raymond Blackwell, Private Collection, 1976. 1976. That was 49 years ago. Marcus did the math automatically, an old habit from his engineering days. Whatever this was, it had been sitting here since he was -8 years from being born. He set down his pack and opened the nearest crate. The nails squealed as he pried off the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were paintings. He lifted one carefully, unwrapping the fabric to reveal a landscape, oil on canvas, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. Even to Marcus's untrained eye, it looked old and valuable. The signature in the corner meant nothing to him, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. He rewrapped it carefully and moved to the next crate. This one held smaller items wrapped individually, sculptures, figurines, objects that gleamed gold and silver under his flashlight beam. He picked up one, a small jade carving of a dragon, intricate and beautiful. His hands were shaking now, but not from the cold. He moved to one of the metal containers and opened it. Inside were stacks of paper, documents in plastic sleeves. He pulled one out and read by flashlight. Bearer bonds, issued in 1973, face value of $100,000 each. And there were dozens of them. Marcus's breath came, in short gasps. He moved to the filing cabinets and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were more documents, meticulously organized in hanging folders. One was labeled Inventory. He pulled it out. The list went on for pages. Gold bars, rare coins, vintage wines, ancient artifacts, stolen paintings, missing sculptures. Each item was catalogued with an estimated value written in careful handwriting. Marcus's eyes scanned down the page, the numbers getting larger and larger until they stopped making sense. 10 million, 20 million, 50 million. At the bottom of the inventory list, in the same careful handwriting, was a final notation. Total estimated value, as of December 1976, $245 million. Marcus sat down hard on the stone floor, the papers falling from his numb fingers. $245 million. Hidden in a mountain, forgotten, waiting. His flashlight beam swept across the room again, and he saw more now. A sleeping bag rolled. In the corner, rotted with age, empty food cans, a camping stove. Someone had lived here, at least for a while. Someone had brought all of this up here, piece by piece, and sealed it away. The question was why? And the bigger question, the one that made Marcus's stomach twist with something between hope and dread, was what happened to them. He stood slowly and moved to the desk. The papers on top were covered in dust, but when he brushed it away, he could see handwriting, letters, journal entries. He picked up the top page and began to read. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it out. My name is Raymond Blackwell. I was born in 1928 in Boston, Massachusetts. I made my fortune in shipping and import, built an empire worth $500 million by the time I was 45. But I made my fortune the wrong way, through theft, through deals with criminals, through turning a blind eye to things I should have stopped. Marcus read faster, his flashlight beam steady, on the yellowed paper. By 1975, I knew they were coming for me. Federal investigators, the FBI, people I'd crossed who wanted revenge. I couldn't run with everything I'd collected, and I couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. So, I bought this land through shell companies. I hired men to dig this chamber, and over 6 months, I brought everything here. Every piece of art I'd stolen, every illegal artifact, every dollar I'd hidden from the government. I sealed it away, thinking I'd come back when things cooled down, when I could start fresh. The letter continued. But I'm 74 now, and I'm dying. Cancer. Maybe 6 months left, the doctors say. I never did come back to this place. Never found the courage. The men I hired to dig the chamber, I paid them well and made sure they couldn't find it again. Only I know where this is. Only I have the map. And when I'm gone, it dies with me. Maybe that's justice. Maybe that's what I deserve. If someone does find this place, know that every piece in here was obtained through someone else's pain. Every dollar represents a choice I made to value money over people. Do with it what you will, but know its history. Know what it cost. The letter was dated December 31st, 1976. Marcus set it down carefully and picked up another page. This one was shorter, written in a shakier hand. It's been 3 weeks since the last entry. I'm back in Boston. The cancer is worse. I won't make it to spring. I've thought about telling someone about the chamber, about leaving a map, but I can't. The shame is too great. Let it stay buried. Let it be forgotten. Let the mountain keep its secrets. That was the last entry. Raymond Blackwell had taken his secret to the grave, had died probably in early 1977, nearly 50 years ago, never telling anyone what he'd hidden in these mountains, and it had sat here ever since, waiting in the dark, preserved by the cold, dry air, and the miles of rock between it and the world. Marcus stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by stolen treasures and the confession of a dying man, and felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. Outside, the storm still raged, but in here, in this secret place, time had stopped in 1976 and waited. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what this meant, didn't know if this fortune was legally his, or belonged to someone else, or should be turned over to authorities. All he knew was that his life, which had been frozen and motionless for 7 years, had just cracked wide open. And whether he wanted it or not, everything was about to change. Marcus made his way back to the shelter entrance and looked out at the storm. The snow was still falling thick and heavy, the wind still howling. He wasn't going anywhere tonight, maybe not tomorrow either, which meant he had time. Time to think, time to process what he'd found, time to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He returned to the chamber and began to explore more carefully, his engineer's mind cataloging everything he saw. The crates were organized by type. One section held artwork, another held gold bars stacked like cordwood, each one stamped with refinement dates from the 1960s and early 70s. There were ancient artifacts that looked like they belonged in museums, pottery and weapons, and jewelry that might be thousands of years old. There were rare coins in protective cases. There were documents that, even to Marcus's untrained eye, looked historically significant. And in the back of the chamber, behind a stack of smaller crates, he found something else. A smaller door, also steel, also locked. This one was newer, maybe installed in the early 2000s, based on the style of the lock. Attached to it was a note in different handwriting, younger, more rushed. Dad, if you're reading this, I found your map. Took me 3 years to locate this place. I came up here in 2003, opened the chamber, saw what you'd hidden. I can't believe you carried this secret your whole life. I can't believe you died without telling anyone. I've sealed the main chamber again, added this second door for extra security. I don't know what to do with any of this. The authorities would confiscate it all. Criminal organizations might kill for it. So, I'm leaving it here, just like you did. Maybe someday I'll figure out the right thing to do, but for now, it stays hidden. Your son, Michael Blackwell. So Raymond had a son who'd found this place 22 years ago and made the same choice his father did, to leave it buried, to let the secret keep itself, which meant Marcus was the third person in nearly 50 years to stand in this chamber, the third person to face this impossible decision. He sat down at the desk again and picked up Raymond's letter, reading it more carefully this time. The old man had been eaten alive by guilt, had known that everything he'd accumulated had been built on the suffering of others. He'd hidden it, not just to escape prosecution, but because he couldn't face what he'd become. Marcus understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. He understood running from guilt, understood hiding from the person you used to be. The mining accident had happened 11 years ago. Marcus had been the lead engineer on a copper extraction project in Nevada, responsible for a crew of 32 men working 3,000 feet underground. He'd signed off on the safety reports. He'd approved the support structures. He'd assured everyone that the new shaft was sound. It wasn't. A structural failure, a cascade of collapses that brought down half the tunnel system. 12 men died. 12 men with families, with children, with futures. And Marcus, who had done everything by the book, who had followed every regulation, who had checked every calculation, still couldn't escape the weight of it. The investigations cleared him of negligence. The company cleared him of liability. But Marcus couldn't clear himself. So, he'd walked away, quit the industry, sold everything he owned, disappeared into these mountains where no one could find him, and he couldn't hurt anyone else. For 7 years, he'd lived with the silence and the solitude and the endless loop of that day playing in his head. 7 years of penance. 7 years of exile. And now this. A fortune built on someone else's crimes. A dying man's confession. A choice that would force him back into the world he'd abandoned. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. He was trapped in this shelter with $245 million in stolen goods, and the ghost of a man who'd been consumed by his own guilt. The parallels weren't lost on him. He could walk away. When the storm cleared, he could seal the door, pile the rocks back, pretend he'd never found this place. Let it stay hidden for another 50 years. Let someone else stumble upon it eventually. That was the safe choice. The choice that let him keep his isolation, his penance, his carefully constructed exile. Or he could do something else, something harder. He could take this fortune, this blood money, and try to make it mean something. Try to turn it into something good. Maybe that was what Raymond had wanted all along. Maybe that was why he'd left the confession. Not as a warning, but as an invitation. A chance for whoever found this place to do what he couldn't, to make things right. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chamber, surrounded by secrets, and made lists in his head. Lists of what needed to happen. Lists of who to contact. Lists of how to even begin to untangle something this complicated. The legal issues alone would be staggering. Questions of ownership, of statute of limitations, of whether this counted as found treasure or stolen property. Questions of taxes and claims, and competing interests. But beneath all the practical concerns was something simpler, something more fundamental. What kind of man did Marcus want to be? The man who hid from his past, or the man who faced it? The man who stayed frozen in his guilt, or the man who tried to make amends? Morning came, though Marcus couldn't see it from deep in the chamber. He knew it was daylight only because his watch told him so. He made his way back through the tunnel to the main shelter. The storm was still raging, but with less intensity. Maybe by afternoon it would clear enough for him to attempt the hike back to his cabin. Maybe. He ate more jerky, drank water that was starting to freeze in his bottle, and thought about the 12 men. He thought about their faces, their families, their final moments. He thought about the years he'd spent trying to make peace with what happened. And he thought about Raymond Blackwell, who'd spent his last months writing confessions to no one, hoping that someone, someday, would find his secrets and judge him less harshly than he judged himself. Marcus returned to the chamber one more time. He took photos with his phone, documenting everything. The crates, the gold, the paintings, the documents, Raymond's letters, Michael's note, all of it. Evidence, proof, a record that this was real, that he hadn't imagined it, that when he walked out of here and told this story, people would believe him. Then, he did something else. He took one of the bearer bonds, just one, and tucked it into his jacket pocket, not to cash it, not to keep it, but as a reminder, a physical token of this moment, of this choice, of this impossible gift the mountain had revealed. By mid-afternoon, the storm finally began to break. The wind died down to a manageable howl. The snow thinned enough that Marcus could see maybe 100 feet. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough. He packed his gear, took one last look at the steel door and the chamber beyond, and stepped out into the white wilderness. The hike back to his cabin took 4 hours, twice as long as it should have. He was exhausted, half frozen, running on adrenaline and stubborn determination. But when he finally saw the familiar shape of his cabin through the trees, relief flooded through him so powerfully, his knees almost buckled. He was alive. He'd survived. And he was carrying a secret that would change everything. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire until his small stove roared with heat. He stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped himself in blankets. He made coffee, strong and black, and sat by the fire while feeling slowly return to his fingers and toes. And he looked at the photos on his phone, scrolling through images of crates and gold and a dead man's confession, and knew that his 7 years of hiding were over. Tomorrow, he would hike down to the valley. Tomorrow, he would make a phone call. Tomorrow, he would start the long process of stepping back into the world. But, tonight, he sat alone in his cabin on the mountain and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of hope. Maybe the first small crack in the wall of guilt and isolation he'd built around himself. The storm had brought him to that shelter. Chance had led him to move those stones. And whatever came next, whatever complications and challenges and changes this discovery brought, Marcus Kane was ready to face them. Because for the first time in 7 years, he had a purpose beyond survival. He had a chance to take something born from crime and guilt and suffering and turn it into something that mattered. A chance to honor Raymond Blackwell's final wish. A chance, maybe, to forgive himself. The fire crackled. The wind outside settled to a whisper. And deep in the mountain, in a sealed chamber that had kept its secrets for nearly 5 decades, $245 million waited in the dark. Marcus spent that first night in his cabin, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling beams while his mind replayed every detail of what he'd found. The photos on his phone felt like proof of something impossible, like evidence of a dream he couldn't quite shake. By the time gray dawn light filtered through his small windows, he'd made a decision. He needed to go back. He needed to see it again, to document everything properly, to understand the full scope of what Raymond Blackwell had hidden in that mountain. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow that sparkled under a cloudless sky. The temperature had dropped to maybe 5 degrees, cold enough that the air felt solid, but at least the wind was gone. Marcus packed carefully this time. Extra batteries for his flashlight, his camera, a notebook, protein bars, and enough gear to stay overnight if he needed to. He wasn't taking chances. The hike back took most of the morning. The new snow made everything harder, each step requiring him to break trail, to fight through drifts that sometimes reached his waist. But he remembered the route now, could retrace his panicked path from 2 days ago. The rock face appeared around noon, that same dark stone wall rising from the white landscape like a monument. Marcus cleared the entrance again, pulling away snow that had drifted against the opening. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The tarp spread on the floor, the scattered stones where he'd uncovered the door, and beyond that steel barrier, the secrets waiting in the dark. He opened the wheel lock more easily this time. The mechanism loosened from his previous work. The door swung inward with that same pained groan. Marcus stepped into the tunnel, his flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed to resist the light. The temperature dropped immediately. Down here, sealed away from the sun, it was probably 20 degrees, cold enough to preserve everything perfectly. The chamber opened before him, exactly as he remembered. Crates stacked against curved walls, filing cabinets standing like sentries, that wooden desk in the center with its burden of yellowed papers. But now, with time and composure on his side, Marcus could truly see the magnitude of what he'd discovered. He started with the crates along the eastern wall, the ones he hadn't opened during his first panicked exploration. The first contained more artwork, but these pieces were different, larger, more significant. He unwrapped a canvas carefully and found himself staring at a painting that made his breath catch. Even to his untrained eye, this looked important. The style, the technique, the way the paint had been applied in thick, confident strokes. He turned it over carefully. On the back, in faded pencil, was a notation: Monet, 1892, acquired Rome, 1973. Monet. Marcus knew that name. Everyone did. This wasn't just a valuable painting. This was a masterpiece, and according to the notation, it had been acquired, which Marcus understood to be a polite way of saying stolen, in Rome, 52 years ago. He rewrapped it with shaking hands and moved to the next crate. This one held sculptures, small bronze figures that looked ancient. Greek, maybe, or Roman. Each one wrapped individually, each one tagged with acquisition dates from the 1960s and early 70s. Marcus pulled out his notebook and started making lists, trying to catalog what he was seeing. The scope of it overwhelmed him. The next section of crates contained something different. When Marcus pried open the lid, he found himself staring at gold bars. Not one or two, but dozens of them, stacked in neat rows, each one stamped with refinement, information, and dates. He lifted one carefully. It was surprisingly heavy, maybe 25 pounds, dense and cold, and undeniably real. The stamp read, Credit Suisse, 999 pure, 1974. Marcus set it down and counted. 36 bars. In this crate alone. At current gold prices, maybe $25 million worth, just in this one box. And there were 3 more crates the same size, stacked beside it. His hands were shaking again, but not from cold. He moved to the filing cabinets and began pulling out folders, reading by flashlight, trying to piece together the story. What he found was meticulous documentation of a criminal empire. Raymond Blackwell hadn't just been a wealthy collector. He'd been a facilitator, a middleman between thieves and buyers. His shipping company had provided the perfect cover. Art, stolen in Europe, would arrive in Boston, hidden in legitimate cargo. Ancient artifacts, looted from archaeological sites in the Middle East, would pass through his warehouses. Gold moved from Switzerland to the Caribbean, all under the protection of manifests that showed only legal goods. The folders contained invoices, shipping records, correspondence with people who signed only with initials or code names. There were photographs of items before they were shipped, documentation of provenance, both real and forged. There were lists of buyers, wealthy collectors who didn't ask questions as long as the price was right. And there were ledgers, page after page of transactions, showing money flowing in and out, payments made, percentages taken, fortunes accumulated. Marcus found a folder labeled Personal Correspondence and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Raymond's careful hand. They weren't business letters. They were confessions. Letters to his wife, who had died in 1968. Letters to his son Michael. Letters to himself. All of them written but never sent, documenting his growing guilt and fear. One letter, dated March 1975, read, Margaret, I know you've been gone 7 years, but I still write to you because you're the only one who ever made me want to be better. If you could see what I've become, what I've built this fortune on, you'd be ashamed. I'm ashamed. Every piece in my collection represents someone's loss. Every dollar in my account comes from someone else's pain. I thought I could justify it. Thought I could separate the business from the man. But I can't. At night, I see their faces. The museum curators whose collections were raided. The archaeologists whose life's work was stolen. The families whose heirlooms disappeared. I'm a thief, Margaret. A rich, successful, respected thief. And I don't know how to stop. Marcus set the letter down carefully and picked up another. This one dated September 1975. Michael, you're 32 now, with a family of your own. You think your father is a legitimate businessman, a successful importer, a pillar of the community. But that's a lie. Everything I've given you, the education, the trust fund, the opportunities, all of it is built on crime. The FBI is investigating the import business. They don't have enough yet, but they're getting close. I've decided to hide the most incriminating pieces, the ones that could send me to prison for life. There's a place in Colorado, a property I bought through shell companies. No one knows about it. I'll move everything there, seal it away, and if they come for me, at least you'll be protected. At least the evidence will be gone. But I want you to know the truth, even if I never have the courage to tell you to your face. Your inheritance is dirty money, son, and I'm sorry." The letters painted a picture of a man being consumed by his own guilt, someone who'd built an empire and then realized too late what it had cost. By late 1975, Raymond was making plans to disappear the evidence. He'd hired contractors to dig the chamber, paying them enough to keep quiet. He'd moved items slowly over 6 months, driving trucks up old mining roads, hiking the last miles on foot, bringing his collection piece by piece into the mountain. Marcus found the contractor agreements in another folder. 5 men hired through intermediaries, paid in cash, given false names and locations. None of them knew exactly where they were working. Raymond had made sure of that, blindfolding them for the last part of the journey, telling them it was a private vault for a wealthy eccentric. When the work was finished in December 1976, he'd paid them bonuses and sent them on their way. As far as Marcus could tell, none of them had ever found the chamber again. But the most revealing documents were in the last folder, labeled Final Inventory. This was Raymond's accounting of everything he'd hidden. Marcus spread the pages across the desk and read by flashlight, his engineer's mind automatically calculating values, estimating totals, trying to comprehend the scope. 42 paintings by major artists: Monet, Renoir, Degas, Picasso, Van Gogh. Estimated value in 1976, $35 million. Current value, probably 10 times that, 147. Ancient artifacts: Greek pottery, Roman sculptures, Egyptian jewelry, Mesopotamian tablets. Estimated value, $20 million then. Priceless now. 842 rare coins, some dating back to ancient Rome and Greece. Estimated value, $12 million. 144 gold bars. Estimated value, $18 million then. With inflation and gold price increases, maybe $75 million now. Bearer bonds with a face value of $85 million. Rare manuscripts, first editions, historical documents. Estimated value, $15 million. Jewelry, gemstones, and precious metals. Estimated value, $35 million. The total came to $220 million in 1976 values. Adjusted for inflation and market appreciation, Marcus estimated the current worth at well over $245 million, possibly closer to $300 million, depending on how the art market had moved. He sat at the desk, surrounded by the evidence of Raymond Blackwell's crimes, and tried to process what this meant. This wasn't just found treasure. This was stolen history. Every piece in this chamber belonged somewhere else. Museums, families, nations. And yet here it sat, sealed away in a mountain, forgotten for nearly 50 years. Marcus spent the next 3 hours exploring every corner of the chamber. He found wine, bottles of vintage Bordeaux and Burgundy, sealed in climate-controlled cases. He found rare books, first editions of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Joyce, worth tens of thousands each. He found a collection of ancient maps, hand-drawn charts from the age of exploration. He found jewelry that must have belonged to royalty, pieces with stones the size of his thumb, and in the very back, behind the last stack of crates, he found something that made his blood run cold. A small wooden box, maybe a foot square, sealed with a padlock. Attached to it was a note in Raymond's handwriting. Proof. If they come for me, this is my insurance. The names of everyone I worked with, everyone who bought from me, everyone who knew. Senators, judges, businessmen, celebrities, all of them complicit, all of them guilty. Hidden here, because if this information became public, it would destroy lives, families, reputations. I should release it. I should bring them all down with me. But I don't have the courage. So, it stays buried with everything else. Marcus stared at the box for a long moment. Inside were secrets that could apparently ruin powerful people. Names of buyers who'd knowingly purchased stolen art. People who'd participated in cultural looting on a massive scale. And Raymond had kept it as leverage, as insurance, and then sealed it away when he realized he'd never use it. What happens next will force Marcus to confront not just this fortune, but his own past, and the question of whether running from guilt ever truly works. The weight of this decision, of what to do with Raymond's legacy, will test everything he thought he knew about redemption and justice. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will move you. Marcus left the small box unopened and returned to the desk. He needed to understand Raymond's final days, needed to know what happened after the chamber was sealed. He found the answer in the last folder. A medical file. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in November 1976. The prognosis was 6 months, maybe less. Raymond had known he was dying when he made his final trip to the chamber. The last dated entry in Raymond's journal was from January 15, 1977. Marcus read it by flashlight, his breath misting in the cold air. The pain is worse today. The morphine helps, but not enough. I've been thinking about the chamber, about everything I sealed away. Part of me wants to destroy it all, to burn the paintings and melt the gold and scatter the artifacts, so that no good comes from my crimes. But another part of me hopes that someone, someday, will find it and do what I couldn't, make it right, somehow. Return the art to museums. Give the artifacts back to the countries I stole them from. Use the money to repair some of the damage I caused. I don't believe in God, but if I'm wrong, if there's something after this, maybe that would count for something. Maybe that would buy me a few points against the long list of sins I'm carrying. I'm too much of a coward to make it right myself, but maybe someone braver will come along. Someone who doesn't carry my guilt, my fear, my weakness. If you find this, stranger, do better than I did. Be braver than I was. Take this fortune built on theft and suffering and turn it into something good. Please. Marcus set the journal down and sat in silence. Outside the chamber, beyond the tunnel and the steel door and the rock shelter, a storm was building again. He could feel it in the air pressure, in the way. The temperature was dropping even here in the sealed chamber. He'd need to leave soon if he wanted to make it back to his cabin before the next system hit. But he couldn't leave yet. Not until he'd made a decision about what to do with this discovery. He pulled out his notebook and started making lists, his engineer's mind falling into familiar patterns. Option 1. Report everything to authorities immediately. Call the FBI, the state police, whoever handled this kind of thing. Let them sort out ownership, legality, repatriation, walk away clean. But that had complications. Questions about how he'd found it. Questions about whether he'd removed anything. Questions about his background, his past, the mining accident that had driven him into these mountains. Attention he didn't want. Scrutiny he couldn't handle. Option 2. Take what he could carry and disappear. Cash some bearer bonds. Sell a few coins. Start a new life, somewhere far from these mountains. No one knew about this place. Except him. He could seal it back up, leave the rest, and take just enough to be comfortable. But that felt wrong. Felt like theft, even though the original owner was long dead. Felt like becoming the kind of man he'd spent 7 years trying not to be. Option 3. Do what Raymond asked. Find a way to make this fortune mean something good. Return the art. Repatriate the artifacts. Use the liquid assets, the gold and bonds and coins, to create something that helped people. Maybe a foundation for mining safety, to prevent the kind of accident that had killed his crew. Maybe scholarships for the children of workers killed on the job. Maybe funding for better regulations, better equipment, better training. That option terrified him, because it meant stepping back into the world, meant facing people, questions, attention, meant confronting the past he'd been hiding from. But it also felt right in a way the other options didn't. It felt like what Raymond had been hoping for when he wrote that final journal entry. Marcus stood and walked the perimeter of the chamber one more time, his flashlight beam sweeping across decades of accumulated guilt and wealth. He thought about the 12 men who died in that Nevada mine, thought about their families, their children growing up without fathers, thought about the weight he'd carried for 11 years, the crushing certainty that he could have prevented it somehow, done something different, been better. And he thought about Raymond Blackwell, who'd carried his own weight for decades, who'd built a fortune on other people's losses, and then hidden it away because he couldn't face what he'd become. 2 men, 2 different crimes, both running from guilt that never quite faded. Maybe that was the connection. Maybe that was why the mountain had led him here, why he'd found this place during a storm that should have killed him. Not luck, not chance, purpose. Marcus returned to the desk and picked up one more document he'd noticed earlier, a sealed envelope with his son Michael's name on it. He shouldn't open it, knew it wasn't meant for him, but he needed to understand the full story. He broke the seal carefully. Inside was a letter dated January 28, 1977, probably written days before Raymond died. Michael, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and somehow you found the map I left in my safe deposit box. The map to a place I never told you about, where I've hidden the truth of what I really was. By now, you've seen the chamber, seen the paintings, and the gold, and the artifacts, seen the evidence of a lifetime spent on the wrong side of morality. I need you to understand something, son. Every dollar I gave you, every advantage you had, came from theft. Your education, your house, your comfortable life, all of it is dirty money. And I'm sorry. I'm so desperately sorry. You deserved a better father. You deserve to be proud of where you came from. I'm leaving you a choice. You can report all of this to authorities, clear the family name by cooperating with the inevitable prosecution of a dead man, or you can seal it back up, pretend you never found it, and let it stay buried. Or, and this is what I hope you'll do, you can find a way to make it right. Return what can be returned. Use what can be used for good. Turn my legacy of theft into your legacy of redemption. I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. But maybe you can earn it on my behalf. I love you, son. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you thought I was. Dad. Marcus folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. So, Michael had found this place, had read his father's confession, and had apparently chosen to seal it back up. The second door Marcus had noticed, the newer one with the different lock, must have been Michael's addition. He'd come here probably in his 50s, 20-some years ago, found his father's secret, and couldn't face dealing with it. Had added extra security and walked away, leaving the problem for someone else. Or maybe he'd been planning to come back, to eventually do the right thing, and time had simply run out. Marcus checked his watch. 3 in the afternoon. The daylight would be fading soon. The storm he'd sensed building would be here within hours. He needed to make a decision. Head back to his cabin now, or ride out another storm in the shelter. He chose to stay. Not because of the weather, but because he needed more time. Needed to think. Needed to sit with this impossible situation until clarity emerged. He gathered his gear and made camp in the outer shelter, where at least some air could circulate. He built a small fire using wood he found stacked in the corner, probably left by Michael during his visit years ago. The smoke found its way out through cracks in the rock above. As darkness fell outside and the temperature dropped, Marcus sat by his small fire and thought about paths. About the path that had led him from a successful mining engineer to a hermit living alone on a mountain. About the path that had brought Raymond Blackwell from legitimate businessman to criminal to guilt-ridden recluse. About the path that had led Michael to this chamber, and then back to a life of pretending he'd never found it. All of them running, all of them hiding, all of them carrying weight that never quite eased, no matter how far they traveled or how much time passed. The storm hit around 8, the wind ramping up until it screamed through the peaks like something alive and angry. Snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, sealing Marcus inside the shelter. He fed his small fire and wrapped himself in his emergency blanket and watched the flames dance. And slowly, as the night deepened and the storm raged, clarity did come. Not dramatically, not with thunder or revelation, just a quiet certainty that settled over him like fresh snow. He was going to do what Raymond had asked, going to take this fortune and make it mean something good, going to step back into the world he'd been hiding from and face whatever consequences came. Because the alternative, staying frozen in this moment, trapped in guilt and isolation and fear, that wasn't living. That was just a slower kind of dying. He thought about the 12 men again, thought about what they would want if they could speak. Probably not for him to waste his life in exile. Probably not for him to punish himself forever for an accident he hadn't caused intentionally. They'd want him to do something meaningful, to use his skills and experience to prevent other families from experiencing what theirs had, to turn tragedy into purpose. And that's what Raymond's fortune could provide. Purpose, resources, the means to make a real difference. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken, looking at images of paintings and gold and ancient artifacts, looking at evidence of a criminal empire and a guilty conscience. Tomorrow, when the storm cleared, he would hike back to his cabin. He would pack a bag with the documentation, with photos and letters and proof. And then he would hike down to the valley town of Silverton, population maybe 600, where there was a small sheriff's office and a phone that could connect him to whatever authorities needed to be involved. It would be complicated, would take months, maybe years to sort out. There would be questions about ownership, about whether he had a legal claim to any of this. There would be investigations and appraisals and endless bureaucracy. But that was okay. He had time, had nothing but time. The fire burned low. Marcus added the last of his wood and watched sparks spiral up toward the rock ceiling. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the shelter, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not joy, but the simple peace of knowing he'd made the right decision, of choosing to face forward instead of backward, of deciding to be brave instead of safe. He dozed fitfully through the night, waking every few hours to check his fire and listen to the storm. By morning, the wind had died down again. The snow had stopped. Marcus emerged from the shelter into a world transformed into pure white. The sun, so bright on fresh snow it hurt to look at. He took one last trip into the chamber, photographing everything he hadn't documented yet, making final notes in his notebook. He stood at Raymond's desk and placed his hand on the old wood, feeling a strange kinship with a man he'd never met. Both of them shaped by guilt, both of them searching for redemption. But Raymond had run out of time before finding his answer. Marcus still had time, still had a chance to get it right. He sealed the steel door carefully, spun the wheel lock, and began piling stones back over it, not to hide it permanently, but to protect it until he could return with proper authorities. When he was finished, the entrance looked much as it had before, just another rockfall in a natural shelter, nothing to indicate the fortune hidden beyond. The hike back to his cabin took most of the day. Marcus moved slowly, his body exhausted from 2 nights of bad sleep and the constant stress of the past few days. But his mind was clear. His path was set. For the first time since the mining accident, he knew exactly what he needed to do. And that knowledge, that certainty, made the weight on his shoulders feel just a little bit lighter. His 7 years of exile were ending. The question now was what came next. Marcus spent 3 full days in that rock shelter, trapped by a storm system that refused to break. The wind howled without pause. The snow fell in sheets so thick he couldn't see 5 feet beyond the entrance. The temperature plummeted to 15 below zero, cold enough that his water bottle froze solid even inside his pack. But he was alive, and he had Raymond Blackwell's entire life story spread out before him in yellowed pages and fading ink. On the second day, after he'd eaten the last of his jerky and was rationing protein bars like they were gold, Marcus pulled every document from the filing cabinets and organized them chronologically on the stone floor of the chamber. He wanted to understand the complete arc of Raymond's life, how a man went from legitimate businessman to criminal mastermind to guilt-ridden recluse, preparing to take his secrets to the grave. The earliest documents dated back to 1948, just after World War II ended. Raymond had been 20 years old, fresh out of the army, using his GI benefits to start a small shipping company in Boston. The early records showed a man who worked hard, played by the rules, built his business one contract at a time. There were letters to his young wife, Margaret, full of hope and plans for the future. Letters about the house they'd buy, the children they'd have, the life they'd build together. By 1953, the company was thriving. Raymond had expanded from local shipping to international freight, moving goods between Europe and America. The documentation showed legitimate business, proper manifests, clean accounting. This was before everything went wrong. The turning point came in 1958. Marcus found a letter Raymond had written to himself, never sent, dated November 3rd of that year. A man came to the office today, called himself a collector, said he had items that needed discreet transport from Italy to Boston. No customs inspection, no paperwork trail. He offered me $10,000 for one shipment. $10,000. That's more than I make in 3 months of legitimate work. Margaret's pregnant with Michael. We need a bigger house, better doctors, a future. I told him yes. God help me. I told him yes. That first shipment, according to the records, had been Renaissance paintings stolen from a private collection in Florence. Raymond had hidden them inside crates of machine parts, falsified the manifests, and delivered them to a buyer in New York. The $10,000 had felt like a fortune, and it had been so easy. The next documents showed how quickly things spiraled. 1 illegal shipment became 2, then 5, then dozens. By 1962, Raymond's shipping company was handling more stolen goods than legitimate freight. Art from Europe, artifacts from the Middle East, gold from South America. Anything valuable that someone wanted moved without attracting attention, and Raymond took his percentage of everything. The money poured in. The records showed purchases: a mansion in Boston, a summer house on Cape Cod, expensive cars, private schools for Michael. The Blackwells became wealthy, respected, fixtures of Boston society. Nobody asked questions. Nobody suspected that the fortune was built on theft. But Margaret knew. Marcus found letters she'd written to Raymond, dated from 1963 through 1967, pleading with him to stop, to go back to legitimate business, to think about their son and what kind of example they were setting. The money isn't worth your soul, she'd written in April 1965. Every dollar feels dirty to me now. I can't enjoy any of it knowing where it comes from. Raymond's responses were defensive, angry, justifying. He argued that he wasn't the thief, just the middleman, that the art would be stolen regardless. So why shouldn't he profit? That Michael deserved every advantage, every opportunity. That Margaret didn't understand how the world really worked. She died in 1968. A car accident, sudden and senseless. Raymond's journal entries from that period showed a man coming apart. She was right about everything. I was too arrogant to listen, too greedy to stop. Now she's gone, and I'm left with all this money and success, and none of it means anything without her. Michael blames me. He's right too. If I'd listened to her, if I'd stopped years ago, maybe we would have been in a different place. Maybe she'd still be alive. Maybe I'd still be someone worth knowing. But even grief hadn't stopped him. The illegal shipments continued through the 1970s, growing more brazen, more valuable. Marcus found documentation of a stolen Picasso, moved in 1971, ancient Greek artifacts shipped in 1972, a collection of rare manuscripts smuggled in 1973. The estimated values climbed higher with each transaction. Then came 1974, and everything changed again. The FBI had opened an investigation into art theft networks. Raymond's name came up in intercepted communications. Agents started watching his warehouses, tracking his shipments, building a case. The net was closing. Marcus found Raymond's journal entries from that period, watching a man realize he was trapped. They're going to catch me. It's only a matter of time. I've been too confident, too careless. The evidence is everywhere if they know where to look. I could run, disappear to somewhere without extradition. But what kind of life would that be? I could cooperate, turn informant, give them the names of buyers and sellers, but that would make me a target, dead within a month. Or I could hide the evidence, the most incriminating pieces, and hope they don't find enough to prosecute. Make the collection disappear like it never existed. That's when he'd started planning the chamber. Marcus read through the detailed notes, searching for remote property, finding the perfect location in the Colorado Rockies, buying the land through shell companies that couldn't be traced back to him, hiring contractors with cash and false names, creating a vault that could hold his secrets for decades if necessary. The work had taken 6 months, from June through December 1976. Raymond had made dozens of trips, driving rental trucks loaded with crates, hiking the final miles on foot, slowly transferring his entire collection into the mountain. The journal entries showed how exhausting it had been for a man already in his late 60s, already fighting the cancer that would kill him. But he'd finished it, sealed everything away, covered his tracks, and then the diagnosis had come. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, inoperable, 6 months at most. The FBI investigation became irrelevant. He was dying anyway. Marcus found the final journal entries, dated from January 1977, written in a hand that grew shakier with each page. I'm in hospice now. The morphine keeps the worst of the pain away, but it makes everything foggy. Michael visits every day. He thinks I'm a hero, a self-made man who built an empire through hard work and determination. He has no idea. I want to tell him the truth, want to confess everything before I die. But what good would it do? It would only hurt him, destroy his memories of me, taint every happy moment we shared. Better to let him remember a lie than know the truth. The chamber will keep my secrets, the mountain will guard my guilt. And maybe someday, long after I'm gone, and Michael's gone, and everyone who knew me is dust, someone will find it, and wonder what kind of man could accumulate so much, and hide it all away. The last entry was dated January 29th, 1977. This is probably my final time writing. I can barely hold the pen. The nurses say it could be hours now, maybe a day or two at most. I keep thinking about the chamber, about all those beautiful things sealed away in the dark where no one will ever see them. Such a waste. Art is meant to be seen, to move people, to connect us to something bigger than ourselves. And I've buried it, just like I've buried the truth about who I really was. If there's an afterlife, and I doubt there is, Margaret will be waiting to tell me what a fool I've been. She'll be right. She always was. I hope whoever finds the chamber has more courage than I did. I hope they're brave enough to make it right. That's my prayer. If a man like me is allowed to pray, let something good come from all this waste. Marcus sat in the cold chamber, surrounded by Raymond's life story, and felt tears on his face for the first time in years. Not for Raymond, though he felt compassion for the man's obvious suffering. The tears were for himself, for the parallel he couldn't ignore between Raymond's guilt and his own. The mining accident had happened on March 14, 2014, 11 years ago. Marcus had been 30 years old, the youngest lead engineer in the company's history, brilliant and confident, and absolutely certain he knew what he was doing. The project was a deep copper extraction in Nevada, 3,000 feet below the surface. Cutting-edge technology, massive potential profits. He'd designed the support systems himself, had run the calculations 100 times, had double-checked every structural element. The inspections had passed. The safety reports were flawless. Everything was by the book, better than the book. Marcus had been proud of his work, had seen it as proof that he deserved his position despite his age. The collapse came without warning on a Tuesday morning at 7:43. A structural failure in a support column, a cascade effect that brought down half a mile of tunnel in less than 30 seconds. 12 men were working in that section. None of them made it out. Marcus had been in the control room when it happened, had watched the sensor readings go crazy, had heard the screams over the radio before the communications cut out. He'd led the rescue teams himself, spent 14 hours digging through rubble, knowing what they'd find, but refusing to stop trying. They'd recovered all 12 bodies over 3 days. Fathers, husbands, sons, all of them gone because of a failure in a system Marcus had designed. The investigations cleared him. Multiple independent engineering firms reviewed his work and found nothing wrong. The support column that failed had a manufacturing defect, a flaw in the steel that wouldn't have been visible to anyone without destructive testing. It wasn't his fault, they said. Just a tragic accident, the kind of thing that happens, sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts. But Marcus couldn't accept that, couldn't forgive himself. Because he'd been responsible, had signed his name to those safety reports, had assured everyone that the mine was sound. 12 families had lost someone because he'd been wrong. The fact that he'd done everything right didn't change the fact that they were dead. He'd quit 3 weeks after the last funeral, walked away from mining engineering entirely, liquidated his savings, and disappeared into these mountains, where he couldn't hurt anyone else, where his mistakes couldn't cost lives, where he could punish himself with isolation and hardship, and the endless replay of that morning in his head. 7 years. 7 years of exile. 7 years of telling himself it was penance, that he was doing the right thing by removing himself from the world. But sitting in Raymond's chamber, reading a dead man's confession, Marcus finally understood the truth. He hadn't been doing penance. He'd been hiding, just like Raymond had hidden his fortune in a mountain, just like Michael had hidden from his father's legacy by sealing the chamber and walking away. Hiding didn't fix anything, didn't honor the dead, didn't prevent future tragedies. It just froze you in place, trapped in a moment you couldn't change, refusing to move forward, because forward meant accepting that life continued, despite the guilt. The storm finally broke, on the morning of the 3rd day. Marcus woke to silence, that particular quality of quiet that comes after a blizzard passes. He crawled to the shelter entrance and looked out at a world buried under 4 feet of fresh snow, glittering under a sky so blue it looked painted. He packed carefully, taking only the most important documents: Raymond's confession letters, the inventory lists, the photographs of the most valuable pieces. Everything else he left sealed in the chamber, protected by the mountain until he could return with proper authorities. He took one more item, the sealed box, containing the names of Raymond's buyers. He didn't open it, wouldn't open it, but he took it as evidence that this discovery was real and significant and needed to be handled by people who understood the legal and historical implications. The hike back to his cabin took 6 hours through snow that sometimes reached his chest. By the time he arrived, exhausted and half frozen. It was nearly dark. He built up his fire, stripped off his wet clothes, and sat wrapped in blankets while feeling returned to his extremities in painful stages. That night, he made a list of everything that needed to happen. First, he needed to contact a lawyer, someone who understood property law and found treasure and could advise him on the correct legal procedure. Then authorities, probably the FBI, given the nature of what he'd found. Then maybe historians and art experts who could help identify and value the collection. The process would be complex, would take months or years, but it needed to be done right. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He hiked down to civilization. The town of Silverton sat at 9,000 feet, a former mining town that now survived on tourism, and the handful of residents who liked living where winter lasted 8 months. Population 600 in summer, maybe 300 who stayed through winter. Marcus hadn't been to town since he'd bought his cabin supplies 7 years ago. He looked different now, beard down to his chest, hair long and wild, face weathered by sun and wind and time. He probably looked exactly like what he was, a mountain hermit who'd been away from people too long. The lawyer's office was above the general store, a small suite with a single desk and filing cabinets that looked older than Marcus. The sign on the door read, Sarah Chen, Attorney at Law, Property and Estate Planning. Marcus knocked, half hoping no one would answer, giving him an excuse to put this off. Come in, a voice called. Sarah Chen was maybe 50, Asian American, with short gray hair and glasses perched on top of her head. She looked up from her computer and blinked at the sight of Marcus in his ancient coat and wild beard. Help you? She asked cautiously. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. I need legal advice about found property. She gestured to a chair. Sit. You want coffee? He nodded gratefully. While she poured, he tried to organize his thoughts, to figure out how to explain what he'd found without sounding insane. So, Sarah said, settling back into her chair. Found property. We talking about something you picked up on a trail? Or something more significant? More significant, Marcus said. He pulled out his phone and showed her the photos he'd taken. I found a sealed chamber in the mountains, hidden since 1976. Contains approximately $245 million worth of stolen art, artifacts, gold, and other valuables. Sarah stared at the phone screen, then at Marcus, then back at the screen. This is real? Yes. She scrolled through the images slowly, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to professional focus. Okay. This is extremely complicated. Let me make some notes. For the next 2 hours, Marcus told her everything. Finding the shelter during the storm, the sealed door, Raymond Blackwell's confession, the inventory, the stolen art, the manufacturing defect. That wasn't his fault, but felt like it anyway. Wait, no, that was his story, not Raymond's. He told her about the mining accident, about why he'd been living alone in these mountains, about the parallel between his guilt and Raymond's. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes in shorthand. When he finished, she sat back and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. All right, she said finally. Here's the situation from a legal standpoint. Found treasure in Colorado is subject to several competing claims. First, there's the question of whether the property you found it on is yours, public land, or private land, owned by someone else. You said you were on national forest land when you found the shelter? Marcus nodded. I think so. I was lost in the storm. I'm not entirely sure of the exact boundaries. That complicates things. If it's federal land, the government has a claim. Second, there's the question of whether this qualifies as abandoned property or stolen property. Stolen property typically has to be returned to its rightful owners, regardless of who finds it. But if the statute of limitations has expired, and if the original owners can't be identified, then it might be treated as abandoned treasure. Most of it was stolen, Marcus said. Raymond's records show where he got everything, who the original owners were in most cases. Sarah nodded. Then ethically and legally, the right thing to do is return those items to their rightful owners or their heirs. Museums, families, countries, depending on what we're talking about. The liquid assets, gold bars, bearer bonds, coins, those might be different. If they can't be traced to specific theft victims, they might be treated as found treasure, subject to finder's rights, though the government will claim a percentage. I don't want the money, Marcus said. I want to set up a foundation, mining safety, help for families of workers killed on the job, better regulations and equipment. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Because of the 12 men who died in Nevada. Yes, she made more notes. That's actually helpful from a legal standpoint. Shows you're not trying to profit from stolen goods. Shows good faith intent. But Marcus, you need to understand, once you report this, your life changes completely. Media attention, investigations, people questioning your story, your motives, your right to any of it. You've been living off-grid for 7 years. You're about to become very much on-grid. I know, Marcus said quietly. I'm ready. Are you? Sarah asked gently. Because hiding in these mountains, that's been working for you. It's been safe. This is the opposite of safe. Marcus thought about Raymond's final journal entry, about being brave enough to make things right. Thought about the 12 men whose families deserved something more than his self-imposed exile. Thought about 7 years of running from a guilt that never eased no matter how far he climbed. I'm ready, he said again, and this time he meant it. Sarah nodded slowly. Then here's what we do. First, I contact the FBI office in Denver. This is federal jurisdiction, given the nature of the stolen property, and the fact it crosses state and international lines. They'll want to verify your story, see the chamber, document everything. That'll take weeks, maybe months. Second, I contact the State Historical Society and get them involved. Some of those artifacts probably belong in museums. Third, we start the legal process of establishing your finder's rights to anything that can't be returned to original owners. And fourth, we set up a trust for the foundation you want to create. That way, if and when any liquid assets become available, there's already a legal structure in place to receive them. How long will all this take? Marcus asked. Years, probably. 2, 3, maybe 5 years, to fully sort out all the ownership claims, legal challenges, international treaties involved in repatriation. You're going to need patience. Marcus almost smiled. I've spent 7 years alone on a mountain. I think I can handle patience. Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm going to make some calls. In the meantime, don't go back to the chamber. Don't remove anything else. Don't tell anyone else about this until we have official involvement. The last thing we need is treasure hunters or thieves showing up before we can secure the site. She paused, her hand hovering over the phone. Marcus, I have to ask, why now? Why come forward? You could have sealed it back up, walked away, kept living your life in the mountains. No one would ever know. Marcus thought about that question for a long moment. Because Raymond Blackwell spent the last months of his life hoping someone would find his collection and be brave enough to do what he couldn't. Because my crew of 12 men deserves something better than me hiding in guilt for the rest of my life. Because I'm tired of running from something I can't change. And because maybe, just maybe, turning a fortune built on theft into something that saves lives, that's a kind of redemption neither Raymond nor I thought was possible. Sarah nodded slowly, a slight smile crossing her face. Then, let's get started. She made the first call to the FBI field office in Denver. Marcus listened as she explained the situation in calm, professional terms, answering questions, providing details, finally giving them Marcus's location and contact information. When she hung up, she turned to him. "They're sending agents up tomorrow. They want you to take them to the site, show them everything, give a full statement. This is really happening." Marcus felt his heart pounding, not from fear but from something else. Purpose, maybe. Direction. The sense that after 7 years of standing still, he was finally moving forward again. That night, he stayed in Silverton's only hotel, a small place that rented rooms by the week to ski tourists. He lay in a real bed for the first time in years, staring at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, thinking about stepping back into a world he'd abandoned, thinking about facing questions and attention, and the possibility that people would judge him, would blame him, would see him as someone who'd failed. But he also thought about the alternative: another 7 years alone, another decade hiding, another lifetime frozen in guilt that never quite eased. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he'd made the right choice. The only choice, really, if he wanted to honor the memory of the 12 men and the dying wish of Raymond Blackwell and the possibility of his own redemption. Tomorrow, the FBI would arrive. Tomorrow, his story would begin to spread. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, Marcus Kane slept better than he had in 11 years, dreaming not of collapse and screaming and bodies buried in rubble, but of mountains and sunlight and the long road ahead. The FBI agents arrived in Silverton the next morning in 2 black SUVs that looked out of place on the town's snow-covered main street. Special Agent Diana Torres was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, while her partner, Agent James Sullivan, was younger, maybe early 30s, carrying equipment cases that clinked with cameras and documentation tools. Marcus met them at Sarah Chen's office. They spent 2 hours going over his story, asking questions, examining the photos on his phone, reviewing the documents he'd brought down from the chamber. Agent Torres took notes without comment, her face unreadable. When Marcus finished, she sat back and studied him. "Mr. Kane, you understand this claim is extraordinary. 245 million in stolen property, hidden for nearly 50 years. We need to verify everything before we proceed." "I know," Marcus said. "I'll take you there." The hike took most of the day. The agents weren't accustomed to high altitude or deep snow, and they had to stop frequently to catch their breath. Marcus led them along the route he'd taken during the storm, retracing his desperate path to the rock shelter. When they finally arrived, late afternoon sun was painting the peaks gold and orange. Marcus cleared the entrance, moved the stones, and opened the steel door. The wheel lock turned easily now, familiar. He led the agents through the tunnel into the chamber, and heard Agent Sullivan whisper a single word: "Jesus." They spent 3 hours documenting everything, photographing each crate, recording serial numbers from gold bars, examining paintings with flashlights, and making notes in thick folders. Agent Torres opened Raymond's filing cabinets and began pulling out folders, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to grim professional focus. "This is real," she said finally, more to herself than to anyone else. "All of it. The Monet alone is worth 30 million. If the provenance checks out, if this is the painting stolen from the Rome Museum in 1973, this is one of the biggest art recovery cases in history." They worked until dark, then hiked back to Silverton by flashlight. At the hotel, Agent Torres made phone calls while Agent Sullivan continued reviewing photos. Marcus sat in the lobby, exhausted, watching his quiet discovery transform into something official and unstoppable. By morning, everything had changed. The FBI had contacted Interpol, the State Department, the National Park Service, and at least a dozen other agencies. A recovery team was being assembled, experts in art theft and cultural property repatriation. The chamber would need to be secured, protected, professionally excavated. And Marcus, whether he wanted it or not, was about to become the center of one of the biggest treasure discovery stories in decades. The media found out within 48 hours. Someone leaked it. Maybe a local in Silverton who'd seen the FBI presence. Maybe an agency employee who couldn't resist the story. By the end of the week, Marcus's face was on the news. Mountain hermit discovers $245 million fortune hidden in Colorado Rockies. The headlines screamed across every major outlet. Reporters descended on Silverton like locusts. Camera crews, journalists, true crime podcasters. They filled the hotels, crowded the streets, and tried desperately to get interviews with the reclusive man who'd found Raymond Blackwell's lost collection. Marcus refused them all. He stayed in his hotel room or in Sarah Chen's office, working with lawyers and federal agents, trying to navigate the legal maze that had suddenly consumed his life. The ownership questions were more complex than anyone had anticipated. The FBI identified 12 countries with claims to various artifacts. Museums in France, Italy, and Greece filed paperwork demanding the return of stolen pieces. Families who'd had art stolen decades ago emerged with documentation and lawyers. The state of Colorado claimed rights to anything found on federal land. The IRS wanted to discuss tax implications. And through it all, Marcus insisted he wanted nothing for himself except the right to establish a foundation with whatever liquid assets couldn't be returned to original owners. The legal battles stretched on for months. Marcus moved back to his cabin, but it wasn't the same anymore. Helicopters occasionally flew overhead, probably reporters or curiosity seekers trying to spot the famous hermit. Hikers would sometimes appear on the ridge near his property, clearly having researched his location. The solitude he'd cultivated for 7 years was shattered, and there was no getting it back. But something unexpected happened during those months of legal wrangling and media attention. Marcus started reconnecting with his past. It began with a letter forwarded through Sarah Chen's office. The return address was Nevada. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Catherine Reeves. Mr. Kane, you don't know me, but my husband David was one of the 12 men who died in the mine collapse 11 years ago. I saw your story on the news about finding the treasure and wanting to create a foundation for mining safety. I want you to know that I never blamed you for what happened. None of the families did. The investigation cleared you. It was an accident, a terrible accident, but not your fault. We've all moved on with our lives, or tried to. But knowing that something good might come from what happened, knowing that David's death might lead to better safety for other miners, that means something to me. Thank you for not forgetting them. Thank you for trying to make it count. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. He'd spent 11 years convinced the families hated him, blamed him, wanted nothing to do with him, the possibility that they'd forgiven him, that they'd moved forward while he stayed frozen. That revelation cracked something open inside his chest. He wrote back that same day. Then he wrote to the other families. 11 more letters, carefully crafted words, trying to express 11 years of grief and guilt, and the desperate hope that he could do something meaningful with this unexpected fortune. 9 of the families wrote back. Some letters were short, just a few sentences of acknowledgement. Others were longer, sharing memories of the men who'd died, talking about children who'd grown up without fathers, about the ongoing struggle to make sense of senseless loss. One letter, from the daughter of Miguel Santos, hit Marcus particularly hard. I was 8 when my dad died. I'm 19 now, studying engineering at University of Nevada. I want to work in mining safety. Want to prevent what happened to my dad from happening to other families. If your foundation becomes real, if you're looking for people who understand what's at stake, I'd like to be involved. Not for money, for purpose. Marcus kept that letter on his desk and looked at it every morning. This was why he'd come forward. This was what Raymond's fortune could become. Not just returned art, and repatriated artifacts, but a living legacy that prevented future tragedies. By the end of the first year, the ownership questions were starting to resolve. The FBI and Interpol had identified rightful owners for approximately 60% of the collection. The Monet went back to the museum in Rome. Ancient Greek pottery returned to Athens. Egyptian artifacts were repatriated to Cairo. Families reclaimed heirlooms that had been stolen decades ago. The ceremonies were emotional, covered extensively by media, framed as justice finally served. But that still left 40% of the collection, primarily the gold bars, bearer bonds, rare coins, and items whose original owners couldn't be identified. After extensive legal negotiations involving 7 different agencies and 3 separate court cases, a settlement was reached. The liquid assets would be divided, 50% to the federal government to cover recovery costs and satisfy federal claims, 25% to the state of Colorado for historical preservation, and 25%, approximately $32 million, to Marcus Kane, with the stipulation that it be used to establish a non-profit foundation focused on mining safety and support for families of workers killed in industrial accidents. Marcus sat in Sarah Chen's office when she delivered the news, staring at the settlement documents, unable to process the number. $32 million, more money than he'd earn in 10 lifetimes. Money that came from Raymond Blackwell's crimes, now transformed into something that could save lives. "What do I do?" he asked quietly. Sarah smiled. "You do exactly what you've been planning. You build something that matters." The Kane Blackwell Foundation was established in March, 18 months after Marcus had found the chamber. The name was deliberate, honoring both Marcus's crew and the man whose guilt had funded this redemption. The mission was simple: improve mining safety through better equipment, training, and regulations, while providing financial and emotional support to families affected by mining deaths. Marcus hired Miguel Santos's daughter, Maria, as the foundation's first program director. She brought passion and personal understanding that money couldn't buy. Together, they assembled a team: mining engineers, safety experts, grief counselors, lawyers who specialized in workers' rights. The foundation's first office opened in a small building in Denver, but its reach extended across the country. The first grants went out within 6 months: $50,000 to develop better structural monitoring systems for deep mines, $75,000 to create a training program for emergency rescue teams, $100,000 to establish scholarships for children of miners killed on the job. Each grant was deliberate, focused, designed to create lasting change. But Marcus knew money alone wasn't enough. He needed to honor the memory of his crew directly. Needed to create something physical that said their lives mattered. With permission from the families, he commissioned a memorial in the small Nevada town, where most of the 12 men had lived. It was unveiled 2 years after the discovery, a simple but powerful design. 12 bronze figures, life-sized, standing in a circle as if gathered for a pre-shift meeting. Each figure bore the name and face of one of the men, carefully crafted from photographs provided by families. At the center of the circle was a plaque with words Marcus had written and rewritten dozens of times, in memory of 12 men who went to work one morning and never came home. David Reeves, Miguel Santos, James Chen, Robert Foster, Antonio Delgado, Kevin Walsh, Christopher Brown, Marcus Hill, Daniel Kim, Stephen Martinez, Joseph Anderson, and William Thompson, lost March 14, 2014. Their sacrifice drives us to ensure no other families suffer this loss. May their memory inspire us to build a safer future. The dedication ceremony brought together families Marcus hadn't seen in over a decade. Catherine Reeves was there, older now, her children grown. Maria Santos stood beside her mother, both of them crying as they touched Miguel's bronze face. Marcus stood apart at first, uncertain if he belonged in this moment, if his presence would cause pain rather than healing. But Catherine approached him, took his hand, and said simply, "Thank you for remembering them. Thank you for making their deaths mean something." Marcus couldn't speak, could only nod and try not to break down completely. The memorial became a gathering place. On the anniversary of the accident, families would come to leave flowers, to touch bronze faces, to remember. And each year, Marcus would be there too, no longer hiding in the mountains but standing alongside the families, sharing their grief, working toward the future the memorial represented. The impact on Silverton was unexpected but profound. The small, mountain town had been dying slowly for years, its population dwindling as mining jobs disappeared and young people moved away. But the discovery and the media attention brought tourism. People wanted to see where the hermit had lived, wanted to hike to the area where the chamber was located, though the actual site remained sealed and protected as a historical landmark. The town embraced the attention. The general store started selling Silverton Treasure t-shirts. The hotel expanded. New restaurants opened. Sarah Chen's law practice grew so busy she had to hire 2 associates. And Marcus, who'd been a ghost for 7 years, became an unlikely community pillar. He didn't seek the role, didn't want fame or recognition. But when the town council asked him to speak at the high school about his experience, he said yes. When they requested his input on preserving local mining history, he participated. When young people wanted to hear about wilderness survival and living off-grid, he taught them. That last part became his unexpected second purpose. The foundation work was meaningful, vital, but it was Maria and the team who did most of the daily operation. Marcus contributed his expertise, attended board meetings, approved major decisions, but he wasn't needed in the office every day, which left him searching for how to fill his time, how to be useful in this new life he'd stumbled into. The answer came from a social worker in Denver who'd heard about his story. She worked with at-risk youth, teenagers who'd been in trouble, who'd fallen through the cracks, who needed direction and purpose. She asked if Marcus would consider running wilderness survival courses for these kids, teaching them the skills that had kept him alive on the mountain. But more importantly, showing them that people could rebuild their lives no matter how broken they felt. Marcus said yes. The first group of 6 teenagers arrived at his cabin on a June morning 3 years after the discovery. They were sullen, skeptical, clearly not thrilled about spending a week in the mountains with some old guy. Marcus didn't try to win them over with words. He just started teaching how to build a shelter, how to start a fire without matches, how to find water, how to read weather patterns, how to stay alive when everything goes wrong. By the 3rd day, they were listening. By the 5th day, they were asking questions. By the end of the week, one kid, a 17-year-old named Devon, who'd been in and out of juvenile detention, said something that Marcus would remember forever. "You know what I realized up here? That being alone doesn't mean you're free. It just means you're hiding. But coming back, facing your stuff, that's when you actually get to live." Marcus looked at this kid who'd somehow articulated what had taken him 7 years to learn, and felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe, or hope, or the recognition that his story, his mistakes, his redemption, it mattered to someone else. It could help someone else avoid the years of exile he'd imposed on himself. The wilderness courses became a regular program, running every summer, sometimes multiple groups. Marcus taught survival skills, but he also taught something more important, that guilt and mistakes don't have to define you, that facing the past is harder than hiding, but ultimately the only path to peace, that redemption isn't about erasing what happened, but about doing something meaningful with the time you have left. 4 years after finding the chamber, Marcus returned to the site for an official ceremony. The National Park Service had declared it a protected historical landmark. They'd built a small interpretive center nearby, telling the story of Raymond Blackwell's crimes and guilt, of the chamber's construction and secrets, of Marcus's discovery during the blizzard. The actual chamber remained sealed, preserved for future study, but visitors could see photographs, read Raymond's letters, understand the complex legacy of stolen art and eventual redemption. At the dedication, Marcus stood before a crowd of reporters, historians, FBI agents, and locals, and tried to articulate what the past 4 years had taught him. "When I found this place," he said, "I was running from guilt I couldn't process. I'd convinced myself that isolation was penance, that punishing myself honored the men I'd lost. But I was wrong. Guilt without action is just hiding. Real penance, real honor, comes from taking your pain and turning it into purpose." Raymond Blackwell understood that at the end of his life, he hoped someone would find his collection and do what he couldn't, make something good from something bad. "I'm grateful I was the one who found it. Not because of the money, though the foundation that money created has already saved lives, but because finding it forced me out of hiding, forced me to face the families I'd been too afraid to contact, forced me to step back into the world and try to do something that matters. The 12 men I worked with deserved better than me, living in exile. They deserved action, change, purpose. And I hope, wherever they are, they know that their deaths led to something meaningful, that other miners are safer because of them, that other families won't suffer what theirs did. That's not redemption exactly. Nothing can redeem loss like that. But it's something. It's movement instead of stasis. It's choosing to build instead of hide." The audience was quiet when he finished. Then someone started clapping, and others joined. And soon the whole crowd was applauding. Marcus didn't feel like he deserved it, but he accepted it anyway. Accepted that sometimes you have to let people honor what you've done, even when you don't feel worthy. That evening, he hiked back to his cabin alone, the same route he'd walked hundreds of times over the past 11 years. The mountains looked the same, eternal and indifferent to human drama. But he saw them differently now, not as a place to hide, but as a place that had given him time to heal, that had kept him alive long enough to find purpose again. He thought about Raymond Blackwell, dead for 48 years, who'd carried his guilt to the grave, hoping someone would eventually make things right. He thought about Michael Blackwell, Raymond's son, who'd found the chamber in 2003 and chosen to seal it back up, unable to face his father's legacy. And he thought about himself, the third person to discover the secret, the one who'd finally had the courage to step forward. 3 men, 3 different choices, one shared burden of guilt, but only one of them had chosen to face it, to bring the secrets into the light, to try to build something good from something bad. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at a photo he kept there, the memorial with its 12 bronze figures standing eternal vigil. His crew, the men whose deaths had sent him running into these mountains, the men whose memory had finally brought him back. "I'm trying," he whispered to the photo, to the memory, to the weight he'd carried for so long. "I'm still trying." 5 years after the discovery, the Cain Blackwell Foundation had distributed over $8 million in grants and direct family support. Mining deaths in the regions where the foundation worked had dropped by 18%, a statistically significant decrease attributed to better equipment and training. 43 children of deceased miners had received college scholarships. 15 new safety protocols had been implemented at mines across 6 states. And Marcus, who'd spent 7 years as a ghost on a mountain, was alive again. Not happy exactly. Happiness felt too simple for what he'd experienced, but present, purposeful, engaged with the world. He still lived in his cabin, still spent days alone in the high country, still needed that solitude to process and think. But he also came down to civilization regularly, taught his wilderness courses, worked with the foundation, stayed connected to the families of the 12 men. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't like flipping a switch. It was slow and painful, and required him to face things he'd been avoiding for over a decade. Required him to accept that he couldn't change the past, could only try to build a better future. Required him to forgive himself, which was harder than any physical challenge he'd ever faced in these mountains. But he'd done it, was still doing it, would probably spend the rest of his life doing it. Because redemption isn't a destination, it's a direction. It's choosing every day to move forward instead of staying frozen. It's taking your guilt and your pain and your mistakes and trying to make them mean something beyond suffering. On a clear October morning, 10 years to the month after he'd found the chamber, Marcus stood at the memorial in Nevada with Catherine Reeves and Maria Santos and a dozen other family members. It was the anniversary gathering, an annual tradition now. They told stories about the men they'd lost, shared updates on children who'd grown into adults, talked about the foundation's latest initiatives. Before they left, Maria pulled Marcus aside. She was 30 years old now, confident and accomplished, the foundation's executive director with a staff of 20 working under her leadership. "I've been thinking about something," she said, "about what you told me once, that you found the chamber during a storm when you thought you were going to die, that you were lost and desperate and stumbled into something that changed everything." Marcus nodded. "I remember. I think that's what grief is," Maria said quietly. "A storm that makes you feel lost and desperate. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you stumble into something that helps you find your way again. You were that for us. The foundation, the memorial, the knowledge that Dad's death meant something, that was our shelter in the storm. So thank you for being lost that day. Thank you for finding what you found and having the courage to do something with it." Marcus felt tears on his face, no longer ashamed of them, no longer trying to hide. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. "All of them would be proud of what you've built." "We built it," Maria corrected. "All of us together. That's what makes it matter." As Marcus drove back to Colorado that evening, watching the sun set over mountains that had been his home and prison, and eventually his salvation, he thought about the strange path his life had taken. From engineer to hermit, to accidental treasure hunter, to foundation founder, to teacher. None of it planned, all of it necessary. He thought about Raymond Blackwell's final words, about hoping someone would find his collection and be brave enough to make it right. Marcus had done that, or tried to, was still trying, and in doing so, he'd discovered something Raymond never had, that the opposite of guilt isn't innocence, it's purpose, that you can't undo the past, but you can shape the future. That redemption isn't about erasing your mistakes. It's about refusing to let them be the end of your story. The chamber remained sealed in the mountain, protected now, preserved as a reminder of complicated legacies and second chances. Raymond's story and Marcus's story, intertwined across decades, two men searching for absolution, one finding it too late and one just in time. And somewhere in the high country, in a rock shelter at 11,000 feet, the mountain kept its secrets and waited. Because mountains are patient, they outlast guilt and grief and human drama. They witness our struggles and transformations. They hold our stories long after we're gone. Silent testaments to the choices we make when we're lost in storms, both literal and metaphorical, searching for shelter and finding something far more valuable. A reason to come back down, a purpose to guide us home, and the courage to face whatever waits in the light. Anyone can find treasure if they're willing to get lost first, to face their fears, to choose courage over comfort. Marcus Kane spent 7 years hiding from guilt in the Colorado mountains, but when a blizzard forced him into a forgotten rock shelter, he found more than $245 million. He found a dying man's confession, a second chance, and a way to turn his deepest pain into his greatest purpose. Because sometimes the most valuable thing we discover isn't gold or art or ancient artifacts. It's the realization that our mistakes don't define us, our response to them does, and that it's never too late to step out of the storm and into the light. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering incredible tales of courage, redemption, and unexpected fortune. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes getting lost is the only way to find what truly matters.